Welcome viewers to this series of lectures on forests, development and sustainability. This is part 3 in the series that we have earlier carried out, and we shall be carrying the further episodes of this as well. Now what I do in this is basically tracing the forest policies that were enacted and the debates that surrounded it at the time of its enactment, right from the colonial period of Indian history down to the present times. And at this moment, we are just around the time when these efforts were being made, right after, you can say, the British Parliament took control of Indian administration in direct fashion post its management by the EIC, that is East India Company, and this was post the 1857 revolt, and subsequently in 1858 as Indian administration came directly under the British control. Thereafter this kind of idea grew that the reckless felling of trees that was happening in the colonial period, that needed to be managed better. Of course, the pretense that was given to it was the name of conservation of forests. But what actually operated beneath it is a very unabashed, I would say, commercial interest that was very much evident, although they tried to cover it well through the optics of scientific forestry or conservation of forests and so forth. But as we analyze it from today's perspective, we are trying to see it from the viewpoints of what kind of development did it lead to, how genuine was this development, or it was seen somewhat differently from what we understand as development today, and also the issue of sustainability. Now, sustainability is an interesting term because, of course, in the middle of the 19th century, it perhaps would not have reckoned to the policymakers, particularly the colonial masters, as that big an issue. But of course, they were little concerned about how to meet the rising demand of good quality wood and timber, particularly because, as you see, if you have this sense of chronology, you can very easily relate it to the fact that 1850s is the time when railway lines are being laid in India, and railway coaches are being made, and at that point of time the extractive technologies and know-how so far as hydrocarbon fossil fuels are concerned, they were not known and they were not used for fueling these locomotives. So be it the manufacture of the railway coaches or laying of the railway tracks, or even fueling the steam engine, good quality timber was very much required, and it was not only for the railway. It was not only for the railway locomotive, but also for ships in the waterways. So even that was coal driven or steam engine driven, and for that also wood was required in a big way, and that also quality wood. So the point is that as we proceed to discuss this further, there are some I would say some fundamental things that we must take note of because industrial revolution had already kicked in England and the other parts of Europe, and via the colonial masters here in India, some bit of industrialization, although very haltingly and not a genuine one, at least we were becoming aware of it. And then during the two world wars or a decade prior to that, reluctantly, and this we have discussed in the earlier interaction that I had with you on this particular topic, reluctantly the British administrators had to concede and let Indian industries grow in the early decades of the 19th century, mostly constrained by the fact that they were at war. They were in the middle of World War, and during such a situation, on account of several reasons, economic, strategic, and political, they did have to concede some bit of it. So that patches of industrialization apart, the bigger trajectory that we would be tracking of is the industrialization in Europe itself, industrialization of Britain itself, and the fact that they were creating colonies, and India was a prized colonial possession for them. So they are exploiting the Indian forests for meeting the demands, exponentially risen demands of good quality timber generated on account of industrial revolution in England. And also the expansive policy, maritime policies, expansive policy, imperialism that they were carrying out, the market-driven compulsion to earn profit and keep the production process on and so forth. So they were all at work. And we would see through some of the references that we have in some of the documents, and even otherwise try and see as to what was actually underplaying these proclamations, these overtures in the name of forest policy, scientific forestry, and conservation and so forth. This is not to deny that there was no tangent of ideas related to conservation per se. They were there, but in ultimate analysis, the way it played out, we can very conveniently see as to which of the compulsions are weighing more so far as taking some policy decisions are concerned, or the implementation of it, how it is playing out, how it is unfolding through different measures and forest policies. And we will try to take it down to not only the independence of India, even subsequently in independent India also, the way it moved on, and that we shall be talking about in subsequent lectures, as to how forest laws and forest policies, even in independent India, they do carry some unwanted legacies of past. And over a period of time, quite a few of them have been plugged, quite a few of the gaps have been plugged, quite a few of the misnomers have been brought to public gaze, and they are sought to be rectified in subsequent acts and policies and so forth. But if you take a large term or a long term view of this process of forestry, forest laws, enactments, etc., it does tell us some story, and therefore as some kind of a qualifier before we embark on this story of forestry and so forth, let's as a qualifier understand that when we say environmentalism, say in the 19th century context, let's not understand it the way we understand it today. because environmentalism as a post-industrial phenomena is something that we should understand it as. And when we talk of say ecological sensitivity or ecological sensibility or environmental sensibility in the pre-modern times, through some of the community practices, through some of the religion and religiosity associated practices, which had some bearing and positive bearing on ecology and environment. But let's not misunderstand it as something akin to environmentalism. Environmentalism is a distinctly post-industrial modern awareness about the need to overcome the environmental or ecological crisis that we as the dwellers of the planet have run into. And it is of a completely different kind and scale and degree that we talk of when we talk of environmentalism. But some of the practices that we will allude to, which are regarded as the prudent past practices, and some of them continue down to the present times, it is generally argued that that is the that can serve as some kind of a panacea for the ills that ail our forestry and ecology and the environmental crisis that we have run into and so forth. That's a little far-fetched kind of an argument, because it underplays the degree of resource use, the involved energy that's required, and the consumption pattern, the population, the lifestyle. So it's enormously different than what it used to be in the pre-industrial times. And a habit, a norm, a practice, however prudent it might be in the pre-industrial times, will have to be calibrated and will have to be tested whether it can cater to the kind of scale of consumption that we are talking about in the modern context. So that is a ticklish issue, unless there are some economists who now talk of, along the Gandhian lines, who now talk of injecting value and ethics in our consumption behavior, and that can perhaps take care of this better as the pretense of doing forestry in a scientific way, because as we will discuss that quite a few scientific forestry techniques and packaging were actually very misinformed and off the line, right? So one thing that we are agreeing with is that environmentalism of the kind that we see in the contemporary society is a post-industrial phenomena. And let's not transpose it on the prudent practices of past, however good that might be, in the pre-industrial times. So that's one. Second is that ecological prudent practices of past, therefore, need to be understood only in that frame. Right, in that frame of time that we are talking of, pre-industrial time that we are talking of. And certainly they were not inspired by the problem of ecological crisis like situation. At best, it can serve, when we allude to those prudent practices, it can at best serve as some kind of a prehistory of environmentalism, and not as some kind of a panacea for everything that ails Indian forestry. Now, having spoken about this qualification, let's try and understand the process of unfolding of forest policies or forest management right from the colonial times down to the times present, and as we said, that the story begins around the decades of 1850s, 1860s. That's the time when first forest enactment and the forest department was created at the behest of the imperial government over what then was colonial India, right? Also important in our discussion is the fact that it is not only about India that we are talking of when we talk of the situation of Indian forests, say, in the 19th century. Because as our imperial masters at that point of time, Britain itself was undergoing industrialization. And it was actually reaping the benefits of industrialization because it was an early starter in the project of creating colonies. Subsequently, there were several other European powers that were also very much into it. But of course, Britain was the dominant power at that point of time. And through colonialism, it was able to meet a major portion of the demands of materials, raw materials, etc., particularly from colonies, including India. So the maxim of industrial capitalism was very much in operation through its colonial policies towards forests. It is important to realize that beneath the gloss and the pretense of conservation concern, there was this commercial compulsion which was at work, right? Now, when we say maximum of industrial capitalism that was very much in operation, what do we mean by it? Let's understand, let's pause a little bit and understand that capitalism, unlike feudalism, although there are several historians who talk of feudalism also as world system, but very clearly there is an inner logic, there is a coherent inner logic in projecting capitalism as a world system, and that logic is that constantly increasing production, constantly expanding market, and constantly reaping profits. If that has to be operationalized, capitalism will inherently expand itself and will try to engulf as much part of the economy as it can. So there is that inner logic that supports the idea of capitalism as a universal system, capitalism as a universalizer, right, or as a world system. Once it begins at a place, it tends to engulf the other areas into its ambit because of the inner compulsion of constantly increased production, market, and profit. Right? There is no such inner compulsion of production in feudalism, and therefore one can say that feudalism, say in France or in India or in Japan, they look same, they look similar, but certainly they are not the same, and therefore historians keep debating about, say, Indian feudalism or Chinese feudalism or Japanese feudalism and European feudalism, Eastern European feudalism, Western European feudalism, and so forth. So, the point that we are impressing upon here is that during the 19th century, during the 19th century in Europe and Britain in particular, industrial capitalism was unfolding, was creating new situations and demands and requirements for raw material and forests constituted a very convenient site to meet those requirements particularly of say good quality wood and timber, and therefore they were indiscriminately cut. The trees were cut, and there wasn't much of a regulation here. It was just the drive for maximizing one's profit that was leading to felling of trees in a very indiscriminate manner, and that is what the British administrators, colonial administrators here at this point of time are trying to manage, because in order to continuously meet these requirements, they had to manage it better. And it is this management that is at play, and not undiluted concern for environment or sustainability of forests and so forth. Certainly they were concerned as to how to meet these ever increasing industrial requirement that Britain itself was undergoing in a sustainable manner. So this compulsion of managing it better perhaps was very much there, but there is very little in terms of being scientific about it and so forth. And that is what we will see as we proceed in this lecture. Now, merely to ensure that there is constant supply of the good quality wood and timber for this ever increasing hunger for timber and wood by due to industrialization, railways in particular, and that we shall be talking about in the next part of the lecture as to how that is the chief culprit so far as colonial India is concerned with respect to felling of forests. So, if you look at the traditional ownership pattern, traditional ways in which trees and forests were used by communities here in India in the pre-colonial or pre-industrial times, it had a different pattern, and in fact most of such areas and patches where forests or big gardens were there, or water bodies were there, they were commonly owned, and there was no individualized ownership on such patches. And therefore, to manage it for commercial requirements, where the degree of consumption of forest items is many times more than the traditional mode, it required a radical alteration of the traditional modes of resource use in India, and over and beyond this, it also required breaking up of the organic social cohesion that typified the pre-industrial, pre-colonial social relations, and also the approaches towards ecology within which forest resources were so far in traditional terms used. So, I'll end here, and in the next part of this lecture, we shall build this up further and see as to how it operated and unfolded subsequently. Thank you.